Hi, my name is Audrey Emrine Beardsley. I'm an associate professor at Arizona State University. We have developed a show at ASU titled Inside the Academy, during which we interview some of the top educational researchers in the field of education. Today I have the honor and pleasure of interviewing Dr. James Popham. Thank you for being interviewed today.
Happy to be here.
You were born in Portland, Oregon in 1930. Tell us about your family and childhood.
I was an only child, and therefore it was early on recognized how special I was. I never had siblings, so I didn't know what that was like. But growing up from a middle class, lower middle class income family, going to high school, going to college, never really thinking much about what I wanted to do until I finished my undergraduate work. I was a philosophy major, and you couldn't get a job as a philosophy major. Very little demand for Aristotelian philosophers, and so I decided maybe I would teach, and that whole experience and the rather vapid teacher education experience I had encouraged me to go into the field of teacher education.
What type of student were you in school, in elementary and high school?
I think a little above average. I'd say a B until I was a junior in college, and then I realized I'd have enough grades if I really cracked to it in my senior year to graduate cum laude, and since I had studied Latin for 5 years and I like to use Latin cum laude, I buckled down and I got pretty much straight A's my senior year and got out of there with a cum laude.
Cum laude. Was there anything when you were in school, in elementary and high school, that inspired you to become an educator or inspired the educational research that you do?
No, not at all. In fact, I found small children quite repellent. The adolescent kids were tolerable, and so I became a high school teacher, and I really loved teaching in high school. But I wanted to go back into teacher education because I had been on the receiving end of a terribly fraudulent teacher education program, and to the extent that others were experiencing that same thing. So when I went to graduate school, I never took courses in testing, measurement, had no interest in that. I just wanted to focus on instruction. Only later on, when I got into the world, I realized that those who control the test control the whole game, and so my field moved more toward assessment as an influencer of instruction.
You said fraudulent teacher education program. What does that mean? Describe that.
The people who were operating the teacher education program in which I was engaged were promising to teach me how to teach, and they never did. There was at that time, albeit primitive perhaps, a reasonable psychology of instruction. People could learn how to teach, and I had not been taught how to do that. So there was much wasted time, much irrelevancy, much academic posing. And in the final analysis, I left a teacher education program not one bit better prepared to be a student teacher than I had been when I started. And it was fraudulent, and it made me incredibly angry.
And that was at the University of Portland, is that right?
I rarely identify the institution. I try to identify it as a liberal arts university in the state of Oregon.
You can say that into the camera. If you knew then what you know now about education, would you have become a teacher?
Yes, I would probably want to become an educational researcher focusing on assessment. I've learned, Audrey, that I guess the thing that is most influential in shaping what a teacher does in a classroom is the nature of how the effects of that teacher's efforts will be evaluated. And this means that assessment, classroom assessment, large-scale assessment, any kind of assessment that carries with it some contingencies for action becomes incredibly influential. And so I would, early on, want to learn how to create assessments that benefit teachers' instructional decisions. It would be where I spend my time now and where I would have wanted to spend my time if I'd known how to do it.
So when you got your doctorate, I believe you got your EDD in 1958 from Indiana University. What did you study for your dissertation? Did you go right into the assessment field, or?
No, I had no idea I wanted to fuss with assessment. My dissertation dealt with some aspect of instruction. All I cared about was teacher education. I wanted specifically to do a better job with prospective teachers than had been done with me. And so I never thought about testing, and it was only after I started teaching for a while and the tests in America became high-stakes tests and began to influence instruction that I found myself drawn toward measurement as a vehicle for shaping the nature of instructional actions on teaching.
So what did you study for your dissertation?
Something involving the Minnesota Teacher Attitude Inventory. It was a popular instrument at the time, the MTAI, and I studied it. It's one of the reasons I always advise my graduate students that you don't want to get too transfixed by the rapture of your dissertation, because odds are you'll never be ending up teaching in an area associated with it, and I certainly never did. My MTA experience began and ended with my dissertation.
And why did you choose an EDD versus a PhD?
At the time, at Indiana University, there wasn't a tremendous difference in the nature of the classes you took. The only difference was a language. And I was already skilled at Latin. Why would I want another language? And I wanted to finish up the degree as soon as I could to get back into the teacher education game.
And why did you choose Indiana University?
It's a strange reason. When I was working on my master's degree in Oregon, I had taken a course with a professor who had been formerly the superintendent of schools in Portland, Oregon, and the dean of the School of Education at the University of Illinois. His name was Willard B. Spalding. I was impressed with him. And I thought, wow, Big Ten institutions, they are pretty good. And so I applied for research assistantships at several, and received an offer at University of Illinois and Indiana University. And I went to Indiana because they had better married student housing. At the time I had a child and wanted to find a place where I could work on a degree. I got to Indiana University, and then all the people I was studying were at the University of Illinois, where I could have gone. So Lee J. Cronbach and a galaxy of famous people were over there, and I would have had to drive to see them. So I could not say that my decisions regarding choice of institution were born of enlightened good sense.
Okay. Tell us about your first academic positions.
It was a college in Kansas, Kansas State College of Pittsburgh. When you grow up on the West Coast, you realize you're close to heaven, and you want to come back and end your life on the West Coast. And I thought one of the best ways to do that was to go to a Big Ten institution, somewhere out in the Middle West where you could command some prestige and head out to the West Coast again, Oregon, California, something like that. I got to Indiana University, finished my degree there, and discovered that Indiana U placement officials had marvelous contacts, but only in the Middle West. And frankly, one of the only jobs I could get was at Kansas State College of Pittsburgh, a small state college there. And I went there and was happy to have the position, and enjoyed it immensely because it was a small faculty. You got to know your colleagues. We had a number of bright young folks there, and so it was a great experience. I enjoyed it.
Where did you get tenure?
Where did I get tenure? I guess the first bona fide tenure I had, and as I understand you got tenure 2 years ago, and that's why you're looking so tranquil and complacent at the moment. The first time I pursued tenure was probably at UCLA, and I'd never been in any place. I taught at Kansas State College of Pittsburgh, went on to San Francisco State for a couple of years, and then ended up in UCLA in 1962, specifically to teach the course in instructional methods that I'd found most reprehensible when I was a teacher education candidate. So that's where I got tenure, and it took about, I think, 4 or 5 years to get it.
So you went to UCLA, you arrived in 1962, you stayed there until you became professor emeritus in 1991. There, and for nearly 30 years there, you taught courses in instructional methods for prospective teachers and in evaluation and measurement for graduate students. You based your initial work on that of B.F. Skinner?
When I was a grad student, and immediately thereafter, I was very impressed with Skinner's behaviorism approach. You don't remember this because you're too young, but there was a period in the late 50s when the American educator was transfixed with the joys of teaching machines and programmed instruction. And so I had read a lot of Skinner's thinking about that, and became very much interested in programmed instruction as a vehicle. And as a consequence, when I got to UCLA, although I was working very hard with prospective teachers, I also was doing a lot of work in programmed instruction. And Skinner's work was seminal and influenced my thinking a great deal.
Your friend and colleague, David Berliner, recalls meeting you around this time while he was a graduate student at Stanford. You were a young UCLA professor and leading the national charge to develop behavioral objectives. David was with you firmly in the behaviorist camp, but one of David's professors at Stanford, Elliot Eisner, whom we're also interviewing for this show, was against this whole movement. You were invited to meet with Stanford faculty and engage in debate, and David fondly recalls having the good fortune to be sent to the airport to fetch you. Do you remember that?
Oh, I remember quite vividly, and I thought David Berliner was a person well marked for chauffeur duty. I sensed he had an aptitude for left turns that was very difficult to beat. No, I remember that ride quite well, and to this day, whenever we're doing anything together, I encourage him to drive. He doesn't want a tip. He seems to accept it very congenially.
And do you know what he calls you?
No, what does he call me?
Mr. Jim.
Driving Mr. Jim?
Driving Mr. Jim.
Well, it's true. I mean, Stanford was a nest of really smart graduate students and amiable professors, and Elliot Eisner, whom you mentioned, was a wonderful proponent of softer, if you will, approaches to education. And I'd have Elliot come down and teach my classes at UCLA, and he'd have me come up and teach some at Stanford. And it was a wonderful relationship. And the first time I met Elliot, actually, because you're going to be interviewing him elsewhere, first time I met Elliot, he had presented a paper at the American Educational Research Association, and I was in the audience. It was a paper dealing with behavioral objectives. Now, I was a strong proponent of behaviorally phrased instructional objectives. And so Elliot spoke out vehemently against these things. And I remember standing up at the end, I said, this is a golden moment for me because I have never previously heard an AERA presentation with which I disagreed in toto. There is not a single thing that you have said that I concur with. And so we had a lovely discussion thereafter. So Elliot and I became good friends.
Do you think behavioral objectives have a place in today's schools and instruction?
Oh, we made a serious mistake in the behavioral objectives movement. We equated, and I was right there screwing up with the rest of them, we equated specificity with utility. We thought the more specific an instructional objective was, the more it described clearly how a student should behave at the end of instruction, the more guidance this would supply for a teacher. But the truth is that we overwhelmed teachers with far too many behavioral objectives. And as a consequence, they simply fell because there were just too many of them. And the truth is now, to state an outcome according to how you can judge whether or not a student has accomplished it means you have to focus on the measurement. So instead of having statements of content standards or instructional objectives or goals, you might as well move directly to the assessment because that's what supplies you with the information to tell you whether or not the kid has done it, can learn it, has mastered it. And so as a consequence, I don't think behavioral objectives have any role today.
What are your thoughts about the Common Core standards coming?
Well, as I just suggested, Common Core curricular aims, I'll call them, that is what we want students to become. Until you supply measures, they're just talk. They're just rhetoric. They're words that sometimes mean something to some, not so much to others. And the net effect is, until you know how they are going to be assessed, you don't know really what they are. So I think we have to wait to see how we will assess students' mastery of the Common Core.
Ava Baker, your former teaching assistant, research assistant, doctoral student, colleague, co-author, and counselee, remembers memorizing your lectures, including content and details like emphases, gestures, and throat clearings. In your course, you played April Fool's jokes on the teacher education students, usually about their midterm grades. Your course focused on The Paradigm, a science fiction land called Capaga, where teachers were responsible for student learning. You threw fake boulders at students who were not paying attention. You printed and gave out bumper stickers saying, "Help stamp out non-behavioral objectives." a slogan you thought was hilarious and properly obscure. Students and, in fact, all audiences loved you for your clarity and your amazing humor. Most of those who I talked to before this show best note your wit and your humor as one of your best qualities. Why humor in that which you do as a teacher and a writer?
It's an interesting question. Somewhere in one's life, you discover what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are, and if you are accurate in that discovery, you can exercise good judgment as to how to use them. I don't remember. I think I was in high school when I realized for the first time I could make people laugh, and in fact, I was just thinking about it. There was a physician when I was growing up called Dr. Brandenfels, and he was from Germany, and he could restore follicles, supposedly. I mean, it was, we've been dealing with the loss of hair. I find hair frightfully disturbing, frankly, and if one has to have it the way you have yours is okay. But I remember as a kid, growing up and reading in the local papers about this German doctor, Dr. Brandenfels. And so I remember organizing a presentation in one of my English classes as a high school student when I was talking about Herr Doctor. And they laughed. And I thought, ooh, I like that. And so I found I could make people laugh. And sometimes, therefore, if you can use humor as a vehicle for explaining something and keeping people interested for a time, it's a very effective ploy. And so it's become something I do pretty routinely.
Tell us about the Theennial Follies at AERA.
Well, the Theennial travesties were started in 1969 as an attempt on the part of members of AERA to poke fun at themselves in a benign manner. And they've been offered every 3 years since, because at the time, every 3 years, nothing of consequence happened. And so we felt it appropriate to have a 3-year interval. So every 3 years at the annual meeting of the American Educational Research Association, we've been holding these travesties. And we get prominent people to come up and try to take a genial swipe at our field, satirical, expose, and sometimes they're simply brilliant repudiations of the inane qualities of educational research, and they've been wonderful. David Berliner, for example, I was able to persuade to do one only once, and he was quite good. I mean, David has a delightful sense of humor, which, if honed, could get him a long ways in life. But when I asked him to do this, he agreed, and he gave a masterful presentation, but he was simply terrified by it and would never do it again. And we've had wonderful people, Michael Scriven, for example, Lee Schulman, the people who can be fundamentally hilarious. I mean, Lee Schulman's original presentation, maybe it was the second time or the third time, but he gave a masterful analysis of the relationship between factor analysis and psychoanalysis, and introduced this marvelous concept called factor envy. It was simply a wonderful, anyhow, so we've had some very great people through the years, and every 3 years we try to put one on.
Your friend and colleague Joe Ryan remembers the time that you had him on stage and you did something with hats. Do you remember that?
I have done something with many forms of costume, including underwear of various sorts. So no, I don't recall the exact hat one, but I remember Joe Ryan did a very nice job for us.
Okay, good. What did reading Bob Glacier's 1963 article in the American Psychologist, where he contrasted norm reference and criterion reference measures, have to do with the transition in your scholarship?
There are moments when you read an article and at the time it doesn't really speak to you the way it should. I read the Glacier piece because Bob Glacier was involved in program instruction. He was at the University of Pittsburgh and done some very nice work in teaching machines and program instruction. And because that was my interest, I read what he said. But honestly, Audrey, it didn't influence my conduct until a few years later. I was teaching this course at UCLA for prospective teachers, prospective elementary, secondary teachers. And it was a large class, 300, 400 students. And I worked very hard at the course. And not only did the course start getting better, I wanted to study my exams. And my exams at first had very strong reliability coefficients, 0.85 for a professor-made test. That's very laudable. But then the course started getting better and better. And as a consequence, the students started getting more and more adept at the final examination. And you'd have 80% of them getting top scores. And so my lovely 0.85 reliability coefficient dropped. In a period of 2.5 years, I ended up with a negative reliability coefficient. And it was only at that point, when I looked back, I thought, how can I be working so hard to make this course great and getting a negative reliability coefficient? Only then did I look back at the Glacier article, and then I found myself becoming very entranced with the notion of criterion reference measurement.
You later wrote a groundbreaking article titled Implications of Criterion Reference Measurement. This article was perhaps the most widely reprinted article you have ever written. Tell us about that article.
That was a culmination of what happened in my classes with the negative reliability coefficient, reading Glacier, thinking about it. I had a very close friend and a colleague, now deceased, Ted Husick, and Ted and I would talk about this issue, and I remember kind of lying in front of my fireplace. I lived down in the San Fernando Valley at the time, only place I could afford, and Ted and I sitting there in front of the fire and talking about this. And I decided that because nothing of consequence had been written between 1963 and then, I suppose I submitted the piece in 68, because nothing had been written, there was something desperately needed. I think only one article had appeared between the Glacier piece. And so Ted and I set out to kind of think through what was involved in criterion reference measurement and try to get more people involved in that approach. Because you see, whereas traditional norm-referenced approaches to measurement, norm-referenced approaches in which the focus was on comparative score interpretations, whereas that was fine if you wanted to get people into a fixed quota situation, when you were trying to have instruction benefited by measurement, then a criterion reference methodology was what you wanted to have. By this time, I had realized finally that measurement was so darn important to instruction. And so I wrote that piece and thought it through very carefully.
What do you think about the criterion reference test that came about in part due to No Child Left Behind in 2002?
The tests that we've seen in education since No Child Left Behind are, in a sense, no different than the tests that were in place earlier. You see, in a sense, it's inaccurate to talk about a criterion reference test. It really is. Because what you have is a test, and it yields a score, and from that score, you draw an inference, or you make an interpretation, and it is the inference that is either criterion referenced or norm referenced. You can have the same test, produce a score from which you can make a criterion referenced inference, or a norm-referenced inference. Now, what happened after No Child Left Behind is there was tremendous pressure to have tests at all grade levels, 3 through 8, and then something in high school. And people were simply selecting whatever test happened to be on the shelf. And the ones that happened to be on the shelf, more often than not, were of a more conventional, traditional sort, were norm-referenced in their orientation. And so those tests were very prominent. And what people were doing at the state level, creating their own tests, they called them criterion reference tests. But because you have a test that is criterion reference, it doesn't automatically mean that it will be useful to educate children better. You have to conceptualize a test such that it yields a very clear implication for action on the part of teachers. And the tests that we have throughout this country, largely because of neglect on the part of the federal officials who are spending that money, those tests have not been very helpful to education.
Do you think that the large-scale standardized criterion reference tests, as they're referred to, are useful for instruction for teachers?
Better than nothing, for sure. In some cases, barely better than nothing. Because they're not well conceptualized with teachers' instructional decision making in mind. You have to create a test such that a teacher has some clue as to what the kid can and cannot do, and can direct instruction toward the particular shortcoming that a given child has to have or displays. And this is just not often seen. It is possible, eminently possible, to create tests that yield accurate pictures of instructional quality, that is, our good evaluation instruments, but yet can simultaneously supply some guidance for teachers who want to know how better to teach children. And the state of Wyoming is an instance where they've developed a statewide test that does that, and David Berliner and Jim Pellegrino and I and others have been involved in working with them. So it can be done, but the federal officials who crafted No Child Left Behind and who implemented it gave no guidance to state officials regarding the kinds of tests that should be used, and they simply used those that were available, and they are flat out wrong.
So where does the perfect assessment lie? At the local level, at a school level, a classroom level?
I can't imagine that the perfect assessment can be built by busy teachers or school districts where they have a shortage of trained personnel. I think you need some horsepower to make an assessment really pay off for teachers and for kids. And that means I would lean more toward the state level, or indeed it could be national if you wish.
And what about the types of end-of-course assessments and end-of-subject area?
Well, just because a test is called an end-of-course assessment doesn't mean it's going to be any better. You can have the same kind of bonehead mistakes made for an end-of-course test as you can for an annual state accountability test. And I'm frankly fearful that many of the tests now being warmly embraced because they're end-of-course tests are going to be very shabby instruments indeed. Remember, Audrey, not many people understand the fundamentals of how you create and evaluate a test. They just don't know how to do it. And they're well-intentioned, they're trying their best, but many of the tests that come out of these efforts to create end-of-course exams should be sent directly to the shredder and not pass go.
Including college professors at the higher education level.